Hello, everyone. Welcome to GDPR and the Cloud, the 5 things you really need to know. This is a live webinar brought to you by N2WS. You're in the right place today. If you're an organization in the EU or an organization with an EU presence, you are using or transitioning to Amazon Web Services, you're wondering if and how exactly GDPR will affect you, and you want to know how to have a GDPR secured cloud. You're also in the right place if you're interested in the 2 free gifts we're offering today, $250 in AWS infrastructure credits, and a GDPR cheat sheet of everything we're covering today. If you have to drop for any reason, this webinar is being recorded and all this material will be shared with you. Presenting today, we have Ian Thornton-Trump, an IT certified IT security consultant with over 20 years of experience. Ian previously served with the Canadian Forces Military Intelligence Branch and is a global cybersecurity strategist. Ian has deep experience with threats facing small, medium, and enterprise businesses and an interesting perspective to match. For the N2WS view, we turn to Laurent Mombel, Systems Engineer at N2WS. And with that, I turn it over to Ian and Laurent.
Hey, thank you, Ezra. And it's just my absolute pleasure to be here today. You know what? 48 hours ago, we were wondering what can we possibly talk about that has great implications on people's personal private data that would happen, that did happen shortly while ago. And this is just going to underscore how important GDPR and the regulations are moving forward. So we know that the European Union has decided that we're going to put in a regulation to protect the data of individuals within the European Union, but also protecting their data external to the EU. So one of the questions we get quite often is, well, you know, I'm an American company, I'm a Canadian company, does GDPR matter? Interestingly enough, it does. If you are part of a supply chain of IT providers that goes outside of the EU, but includes an EU partner, and vice versa, if you have a customer that is part of an EU organization, they are entitled to the same rights and I'm going to say technical controls that we're going to talk about. Now, enforcement begins on May 25th, 2018, and one of the things that we're going to talk about a little bit is, you know, why that becomes an important date, but also why May 25th, 2019 becomes an equally important date. We'll get into that in a little bit. It is designed now to replace a whole bunch of EU previous laws and something called the EU Data Protection Directive. Now, what's the difference between a regulation and a directive? Regulation is law. A directive is a suggestion, okay? So what happened is they made the directive, and all of these other companies, basically all of these other countries, decided that they were going to build their own data protection policy. Well, as you can imagine, that quickly got out of control, and everyone in Brussels basically said, no, listen, we need to standardize this across the EU. Thus, the General Data Protection Regulation was born. Right. Okay, so there are a few things that you need to know about GDPR. And one of the biggest, I'm going to say, jokes that's used in the GDPR community and the privacy community are the fines. Now, it's interesting because the fines, obviously the top fine, typically reserved for something truly egregious, right? Now, we may look to recent history to find something that potentially is completely egregious. The 50 million or so profiles that were collected by Cambridge Analytics and then allegedly used to influence elections, etc. So that brings into the next part of GDPR that if somebody is collecting your data, they have to have consent. Okay, and it's opt-in consent. So what's interesting here is that you are allowed to collect data in order to service your customers. But unless you tell them that you're sending it to a third party, you're breaking the new GDPR regulation. This is a very interesting one too, is it's really up the ante and put the onus on controllers and processors to really be able to alert their customers if there's been a data breach. And what's interesting is that you have to report it to the regulator, but under certain circumstances, you don't have to report it to the users. However, if the data that is stolen can be interpreted to, quote, cause harm, then you do have to report it to the users as well. Again, we talked a little bit about the territorial scope. It's organizations with data on EU individuals, and that's an important thing to understand. When we talk about data on EU individuals, we're talking about something that is attributed to a data subject. So when we talk about data on EU individuals, they're called data subjects under GDPR. Okay. Data controllers and processors. Now, this is the interesting thing where there's arguments about exactly what processing and what controllers are. What becomes really interesting is all of a sudden now we're into this situation where it used to be the onus for data protection was on the controllers and not the processors. Now there is joint liability. And in fact, the argument can be made because essentially your data controller, when you are grabbing the data. So as an example, employee records all of a sudden make your company a data controller, okay? Customer records may find you as a data processor, especially if you're a reseller or you're selling services. So this is a really interesting issue. However, they've gotten rid of a lot of the muddy waters and basically said you're going to be liable under GDPR whether you like it or not. Now, some of the really interesting things that are going on is the right to removal. The right to removal, it now puts the users in charge, in a sense, and they have the ability to basically go in and ask for you to remove your data. But there's a number of caveats to that, because there might be some business records that you have to retain because of other regulatory authorities. So very, very interesting issues are going to come out from the right to removal and trying to exercise that. Again, the whole point of GDPR was to take those 28 laws that came out of the EU's Data Protection Directive and turn it into one standard. However, certain countries, including the UK and the Germans, have decided that there is information that is so sensitive, in fact, that they've upped the protection requirement level considerably over what GDPR stipulates as a minimum. And we'll get into exactly what that is. Data transfer. This is a very interesting concept as well, that if you are involved in a third-party relationship and you're moving data of EU subjects, that the protections that they're afforded under GDPR goes with it. However, it is quite difficult to talk about how that may be enforced in the future. What's interesting is, as we're understanding third-party relationships due to the Facebook, the Facebook Cambridge Analytics relationship, it's a very interesting question to understand if data is being shared, how are we going to protect it? And there's a number of techniques like anonymization and pseudo-anonymization as well. We can talk about that. Now, common enforcement, this was an interesting scenario where supervisory authorities, in this case in the UK, have something called the ICO. The ICO will be the go-to enforcement aspect. And what's interesting about the enforcement aspect is that essentially there are different distributions of power among supervisory authorities. So for instance, Sweden's supervisory authority doesn't have the ability to leverage fines, right? However, we understand that the ICO in the UK was struggling with getting a warrant to search Cambridge Analytics business. So we're quickly determining that the scope and powers of the supervisory authorities for the enforcement and investigation may be limited and may need adjusting in order to accommodate the regulation. Collective redress is a really interesting type of thing. This is where, as a result of this legislation, you're empowered to seek restitution for unlawful processing. And again, I did notice someone talking about the different types and qualities of processing. I'm going to get into that, but just understand that at this point, as the legislation is written, if harm occurs or if it can be if harm is a reasonable conclusion of the data breach, then indeed collective redress is also available under the law, and that is on top of the actual fines. So that's another interesting aspect to GDPR. Right, so we want to talk about the 5 things that you really need to know. And our first one is it's never too late to start. This is really true because understand that having a plan to deal with GDPR, if bad things happen to you, is way better than not having a plan. So being able to articulate a path to increasing privacy and security puts your business in a much better position. And what's interesting too is you can implement some really easy, quick win strategies to start that journey. One of the fun things about GDPR, or just kind of a side banter about GDPR, is written into GDPR is the fact that it's a violation of GDPR to not understand what GDPR is. So right away, you can at least build awareness in your organization about it, even if you have substantial technical debt to move forward. Don't collect data that you don't need. This is now, I would say, the biggest challenge that businesses have. And this is why it may take you quite past May 25th to understand all of the data that you do have, all of the data that you have accumulated, and what you actually need to function as a business. So this is going to become a really excellent focus of data management and understanding what's collected, where it's stored, how it's processed, and if it's transferred to a third party. This is the big one for all of you folks out there, is that we just don't know. Now, how do you think of GDPR? GDPR is the rule book for a football game. The referees are the supervisory authorities. They make the calls on the ground. This is a very important aspect of it because we don't have any precedents. And as you know, with the Facebook and Cambridge Analytics, we're not 100% sure if anyone has broken the law yet. There is an investigative process that needs to be taken out. We can suspect, we can act with outrage. Investors can unlike Facebook to the tune of $60 billion is what they've lost in market share. But we don't actually know yet if anything that was transpired is actually against the law. So this is the problem, is that we do not live in a world that is simply black or white. We will have to have what those limitations are. Your business might believe that you're lawfully processing data. Someone may accuse you that you're not, and all of a sudden it goes to court for decision. Using a practical approach to understand exactly where you are in terms of GDPR is the best thing, because you will have to take into the consideration of what did you tell your customer you were doing, and were you doing exactly what you told your customer? That's the delta. So if you are accumulating data to process it, to provide services, or to provide products, then you probably have, on pretty reasonable grounds, especially if it's a contractual relationship, a very defined relationship. Understand, though, that the contract cannot be overly favorable towards yourself. There has to be a balance. And ultimately, the data is your responsibility. If you collect it, you need to protect it, even if you have a bunch of third-party processors involved. We'll talk about a little bit about how to ensure that you have proper third-party liability. There's going to be a lot of issues around the data, not necessarily your policies and procedures, but again, it's going to focus on that customer data. So 2018 is just the start. This is very true from the perspective of the enforcement. Now, understand this. We have had GDPR for about 2 years before it became enforced, and not much noise was made about it. And now a few businesses out there are pretty frightened, and it goes across the scale. Now, the most important thing is that if you're called onto the carpet dealing with a supervisory authority, the narrative will be that you have been negligent and deserve a giant fine. Okay? You can mitigate that risk by ensuring that you have taken some steps. Okay? No one is going to get GDPR perfectly right because we don't know what perfectly right is. We have some ideas, we have some best practices, we have some frameworks like ISO 27001, etc., or NIST or whatever. But the reality is that if you need to be able to articulate the steps that you're taking to protect customer data, if the first words out of your mouth is, what is GDPR? And I had no idea about it, it's not going to go well for you. And this is really the interesting thing that I like to talk about, is that the first pen test that your organization gets as maybe part of starting your roadmap to GDPR, you need to be able to show progress on those issues by the time you have your second pen test. So if you're getting a yearly pen test, like the ICO, I believe is recommended for certain businesses that haven't had a pen test, they recommend that you get one. And you're now in a situation where you can show, hey, we had a whole bunch of problems here. We fixed a bunch of problems. That tends to look like due diligence. If you had a whole bunch of problems and those same problems were reported, it's going to be difficult for you to argue that you've made massive improvements in customer security. So, is massive security investment needed, or do you just change your Equifax ways? I use Equifax in place of evil ways. So really the question here is about the issues around, say you do go to AWS and you put a lot of effort into going to AWS, but then you don't adjust the security settings and you publicly expose your data in an S3 bucket. So the question really comes is, yeah, you've made an investment, you've decided to go with cloud storage, but you failed because you left your data publicly available. So it really now comes down to, are you doing good configuration management? Do you have an articulated process? Are you qualified to use AWS? That's another big issue that we're going to have to take a look at. And essentially, you need to know where your data is, what that data is, and how you're using it in the course of your business. If you can't answer those questions, you're going to have a tough time establishing either the lawful right to process or a consent that you've articulated to your customers. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword in that if you have old stagnant data, GDPR demands that that personal data be kept up to date. So if you have a Christmas invite list with names, addresses, telephone numbers, etc., of all your customers from 5 years ago, and you haven't deleted it, you're in violation of GDPR for not keeping it up to date, which probably is not going to elicit much more than a chuckle. But the problem is that all of that data is risk in your organization, and it's needless risk because you don't need it anymore. And that's really one of the issues where we're talking about repositories of massive amounts of personally identifiable information that then gets left out on an S3 bucket. And that is just particularly bad and dangerous for an organization. So this really comes down to be who are going to be the first targets. This is because there is uncertainty about GDPR. Now, what do we do know? We do know that there is a process, okay? We know that generally the ICO will warn a business. They will give you what's called an undertaking, which is essentially a court order to fix your problem. And then they will bring the hammer down on you if you have failed all three of those things. So what's interesting about that process is it's not an instant fine. It is a process. And because it's a process, there will be opportunities for companies that feel that they're being wrongly prosecuted, perhaps like email marketing companies, for instance. They will probably litigate against the findings of the ICO. This will spawn what we call precedents that we can then use to say, okay, this was the exact line that was stepped over. And so this is why GDPR right now, when people say we're 100% GDPR compliant, or make grandiose claims such as some vendors do, indicating that if you buy their product, they will be 100% compliant. We just don't know where that compliance is. We have an idea, but we don't have any firm things that you must do other than to just protect that personal data. So this is the really interesting one, and we kind of made a laugh about the Tide Pod Challenge for data privacy officers because all of these rules, the GDPR subject access requests, explicit consent requirements, and the right to erasure, okay, cue the 1980s band on that, all of those issues have to be taken into account with the current state of your systems and the future state to your systems. And here's an example of the gray area involved. So say you're a massive data processor like Google, for instance, and you introduce some new algorithms and you're not sure what those AI-driven machine learning algorithms are going to actually output. The question becomes, how do you gain the explicit consent of your customer, okay, to subject them to something that you're not even sure what the output is going to be, right? So you have a tremendous amount of different approaches to this issue and problem, and the data privacy officers are the ones that are responsible for protecting that data. So we're going to be in a situation where the data privacy officer might have to say to a business, we need to test this extensively, we need to anonymize it, we need to understand exactly what the output is given the customer data that we're going to input. And this is what's kind of interesting about the Cambridge Analytics dumpster fire right now, is that Facebook may be able to sit back and go, hey, we had no idea what they were going to do with our data. We're now really sorry we gave it to them. Well, that may or may not be good enough, because when we look back at GDPR about the relationship between processor and controller, hey, now all of a sudden it's joint liability. So be very interesting to see how the litigation, if there is any, comes around on that and what the investigation turns up. I think if we can just go back one more, because I wanted to talk just for a few moments about this last one here, about understanding the requirements before implementation. This is very important because as the data privacy officer, you will be called to account to understand that a new system that deals with any private data will have to make sure that it assures and has the capabilities of being able to be responsive to subject access requests, explicit consent requirements, and the right to subject access erasure or disclosure. So, perfect. And the number one thing is, we are seeing right now a tremendous amount of workloads moving to the cloud. A couple of interesting points I read as VMware has released a tool making migration to Amazon even easier, okay? And this mind-blowing report came out from Cisco. I kid you not, in 2021, 95% of workloads will be in public cloud infrastructure, 95%. So the game right now, these folks, is understanding of you're going to probably be moving to a cloud. It needs to be GDPR secure. There are a number of steps that you can take to do that. And keep in mind that the bottom line here is the data that you have is your responsibility. And it goes completely problematic, especially if you're a giant company, if that data goes somewhere that it shouldn't, or if it goes someplace that you haven't told your customers you're going to send it. So there are a number of different challenges when we talk about the cloud and all the advantages that it brings, but also if you don't do it right, you can land yourself into some pretty hot water. So I'm going to introduce Laurent now to walk through AWS and the customer relationship when it comes to the shared responsibility model. Take it away, Laurent.
Okay, thank you very much, Ian, for the first part here. And I think now, our attendees know a bit more about GDPR, and especially these 5 important points that you explained. Now, obviously, we work in AWS, and we wanted to talk about AWS as an example of public cloud. Why? Because AWS is probably one of the most compliant public cloud. And what is great about public clouds, especially as AWS, is the fact that there is a shared responsibility model, as you can see on this slide here. So this means that AWS is responsible for the security of the cloud, if you prefer the infrastructure, obviously the hardware, and also they have a software layer, as you can see there, for database, networking, storage, etc. But then, obviously, customers are also responsible for their security and compliance in the cloud. So basically, you have, despite the fact that AWS or even any other public cloud have a huge responsibility on the hardware side and some software layer, you still have tons of responsibilities as a customer there and a user, you see, of a public cloud. Now, AWS is compliant with GDPR, and we're going to see that you have obviously tools for that. But let me explain a little bit more about AWS, because not only AWS is the oldest public cloud, started in 2006, and they have a lot of obviously experience compared to other cloud, but they also offer not only GDPR compliances, but they also comply with the financial sector, for example. Okay. And also they are compliant, for government organization, because they are started up, a separated parts of cloud called GovCloud, for example. So this means that they are providing already a fully compliant environment, and probably the most compliant environment. So it's a great way to start, if you want to work in a public cloud. Now, obviously, as you can see on this slide, they provide tools as well for you as a user. Okay, I'll give you some example for compliances such as the identity access management, or even they provide security groups, etc., to start your instances. If you want more information about tools and compliances of AWS, they have a document called AWS Compliance Quick Reference PDF that you can find on their website. You can also go to aws.amazon.com/compliance/GDPR/center. Okay, so compliance frameworks, tools. You can also have access to a partner network. In fact, you can go to, for example, the AWS marketplace and find tools to help you being more compliant and also to protect your data, such as firewall, AV, and other networking tools, and to help you, with, for example, your instances of virtual machines, in AWS. Okay. They also have a data protection contract as well. So all this to say that it's one of the most compliant environment, and this is also the reason why they are the biggest public cloud. They have 44% of the market.
So
yeah,
we want to get in now a little bit to the deeper part of AWS and kind of what some of the practical tips for compliance are. When we talk about data, we're really talking about what's being collected and how that's being collected. And that extends as well to metadata. And some of the key areas of that are, identifying the data that you're using, monitoring that environment, centralizing security management, and of course, alerting. Laurent, take us through a little bit of and a little bit more detail around those tools, like cloud-based tools that really kind of help us out on those.
Yes, of course. So just like regarding identifying the data, and this means that you need to use tools to be aware of all the data you collect. So basically, I have a sort of data map, if I can speak like that. Originally, this is something that any company always wanted to have in place, but never managed to enforce it, internally. But now with GDPR, it's your chance to actually know exactly, where your data go and who collects the data and which data you collect. So you need to use tool. Obviously, you could, if you run a database, you may be able to run reports about the user of this database and who writes what and where. So make sure, for example, that your database records, for example, what the users are doing and the record they are amending or they are adding there to the database. Obviously, monitoring your environment is essential. You can find on the market real-time monitoring tools. And even what is very important is that having a way to centrally monitor, for example, let's say your security products. If you have antivirus or even backup products, you have the possibility, and there's a lot of, for example, backup products that offer the possibility to centrally manage, all your backups, and all your backup sessions there. And what also is important is a centralized security management. For example, you may have like tons of security tools, like I was saying, antivirus, backup products, but all these very often have an API to actually push, some data to, for example, a dashboard. You can find on the market, products, dashboard products that can receive, data from other applications via API. And centralizing as much as you can your security is essential. Okay, there. And obviously there is alerting. You can get real-time alerts and report, or at least if you choose, security products such as a backup product, you need to make sure that this backup product, for example, can give you real-time alerts and reports.
Yeah, so I just want to jump in on that last one because those alerts and reports are really the evidence of due diligence that you need to have. Because don't forget, GDPR encompasses the confidentiality of that personal data, the integrity of that personal data, i.e. it's got to be right, and the availability of that data. So not having a backup is not an option when it comes to GDPR, and not being able to produce an audit report on who was in doing what also is an issue, because you have to have a documentation of your process. And if you're taking data and not processing it in accordance with the way that you said that you were, you now can find yourselves into some really hot water.
Absolutely.
So one of the other things that we really talked about, and I just kind of hit on, is regular audits. Regular audits are going to be that proof of due diligence that you're looking for. The threat detection, this is interesting because we know that the threat landscape is changing. We're dealing with very difficult to find malware, etc. What we're now talking about is some forensic capabilities. I'm going to get Laurent to expand on that in a moment. The 72 hours to respond to data breach, or at least to investigate it and potentially inform the supervisory authority if there is discernible harm. And then, of course, an overall incident response plan. Having an incident response plan really puts you into the category of understanding what's at stake and what you're doing to protect. So, Laurent, expand a little bit on those areas if you could.
Yeah, obviously, when you're going to consider some tools to help you, to be compliant with GDPR, you need to make sure that you can conduct audits. I was already talking about, for example, a database, that has the possibility to generate reports and audits about what the users are doing in there. You also, to help you, you need to make sure that you have, for example, such a product that can enable you to generate custom reports that you can receive automatically in your inbox, on a regular basis. So this is the start of creating audits, you see, and regular audits. Okay. Obviously, we were talking about, reliable threat detection products such as, for example, an antivirus, and making sure that this enables you to track, obviously any particular threats, that have been detected. And you can obviously respond as fast as possible. I'll give you another example. Having a backup product that just doesn't recover the data straight onto the original machine, but maybe enable you to recover an identical machine that you can put in production, so you can carry on your investigation on the original machine, virtual or physical, to be able to find out, what happened there, and where the threats, has been coming from. Okay.
That piece is probably one of the most important situations, because when you're talking about cloud services that are customer facing, you can't take production offline. That will cost your organization a tremendous amount of money. But if there is a suggestion or indications of compromise that you need to investigate, being able to restore that image and then do your analysis in an offline capacity makes life a lot easier.
Absolutely.
So again, when we look at GDPR, it's got a number of requirements based on what we would call acceptable best practices in the industry. One of the, I'm going to say, true industry aspects to best practices is having a proper backup, which is then somewhat expanded under GDPR for disaster recovery. Also, I mean, the use of encryption, obviously, the old data breach scenarios of the unencrypted backup tapes being stolen or lost, storage limitations, interesting under GDPR because you are going to be limited to what your data you can retain. That's an interesting discussion all of its own, because essentially you've got to figure out how to segment data that you need to keep under law, but also data that can be removed. And of course, enabling the right to forget. And I've got some comments about right to forget from a policy perspective at the end. But, Laurent, there are a number of areas where backup has a role to play in that professional management of GDPR requirements.
Yes, absolutely. Well, can we go back? Yeah, I just wanted to comment on that. Obviously, you need backup is the ultimate security layer. Okay, when everything else hasn't been working, so being able to recover your data, and obviously you need to have a proper disaster recovery plan in place, and especially you need to be able to test it. But it has to be also simple enough, in place. So you need to be able to to check when you're selecting, for example, your backup tool, to make sure that it is easy to use and especially easy to recover, and you need to try to automate your recovery as much as possible. Okay, that's very important. You were talking about encryption. When we talk about encryption, you don't absolutely need to encrypt absolutely all your data, but ideally, the most sensitive data, encryption at rest or in transit. But you have also another part of it, which is anonymization. Okay, so for example, making sure that for each record that you have or personal data of a data subject correspond maybe to a number. Okay, so which, for example, data we're talking about by identified by the number and not by the actual sensitive data, such as a name or an address. Okay, so that's important. So, and there are products on the market that will enable you to do that. Okay, obviously, storage limitation, making sure that if, for example, you select a backup product, that you can set manually your retention periods and as precise as possible. And another very important point is the right to forget. I get sometimes customers asking me that, how do you deal with backups? For example, if you need to amend or even to delete a data subject details, that have been kept, in the backup, like for example, if you have hundreds of backup sessions, obviously you cannot just go and edit a backup session. Well, again, what is important about GDPR? It's a 100% risk base. So as long as you prove that you put everything in place to comply to GDPR, you should be on the safe ground. And when it comes to the right to forget, well, we're not going to ask you, for example, that to go and amend each backup session. But what you can do is, well, keep track of the data that needs to be amended and that needs to be deleted. And if you need to restore after a disaster, a particular database, for example, make sure you amend this data before you put this database online.
Yeah, and that can be done pseudo-anonymously as well. So for instance, if you had a database and you've kept track of 25 rows in that database that the customer has asked to have their information removed, you can restore the backup and then remove those 25 table rows, putting you in compliance with GDPR when it goes back into production. One of the other aspects I wanted to talk about in terms of right to be forgotten, if you can segregate your database into different databases and different tables, it gives you flexibility in order to meet that right to be forgotten. So as an example, if you have a CRM system and you get a customer that wants their details removed from your customer relationship management system, you can delete them and that information, and then you can say in 22 days, when our data retention policy for that particular database is completely removed, there will be no trace of you in our CMR database anymore. However, if you had a sales database and by law you have to keep their information for 7 years, then you can say after the 7-year retention period, your information will be no longer available in the database. So keep in mind that the right to forget or the right to erasure does have the ability for the organization to reasonably stipulate a time of retention. The right to be forgotten is not instantaneous. So let's move along. We're kind of at 20 minutes to go or so. So 5 points, it's never too late to start, but the later to start, the harder it gets. This is true, but have a plan. Build your GDPR plan. Again, declare war on data and start removing old and inaccurate data that is no longer required. Again, regulations are deliberately vague. It's up to the courts to decide exactly where, the line will fall, and use the practical approach. Do what is reasonable, and you shouldn't have any problem convincing regulatory authorities that you're acting in due diligence. And finally, understand the data that you collect, that you put up in the cloud, it's your responsibility to protect it. Protection includes confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And N2WS builds a great product for that. So I would say if there's the one thing to take away today is to understand that you're responsible for your AWS cloud compliance with GDPR. AWS has made a lot of strides to make that easier and has a marketplace where a lot of the tools and techniques that we talked about today are available. But ultimately, the more you do under this heading, the more diligence that you're exercising, and that is good for your compliance posture. So the question, of course, becomes, how do you comply with new GDPR regulations as easily and cost effectively as possible? Well, for that, I'm gonna talk to Laurent and basically say, you have a choice, don't you there, Laurent?
Absolutely, especially when it comes to backup. We have a product that we call Cloud Protection Manager, which can help you with this. And in fact, what is interesting about Cloud Protection Manager is that it delivers on all the GDPR requirements we've just listed and explained. Okay, so it's fully GDPR compliant. Well, first, because the way it works is we leverage the snapshot capability of AWS. So basically your data stays in one place, so it's easy to track. And this one place is your AWS account, as simple as that, okay? Secondly, what is interesting about a Cloud Protection Manager is that it is deployed on an instance, if you prefer a virtual machine, in your own AWS account. So this means that all the backup metadata stays in your own AWS account, unlike, for example, a SaaS application, okay, that you will use being hosted somewhere else. So it's probably the most effective and efficient backup recovery solution in AWS. Okay, it's made for AWS, easy to use and to set up as well.
I like the idea that if you've made an investment in a bunch of cloud protection technology to protect your AWS cloud, that now you're plugging in something and you don't have to go through the process again of securing this new cloud or asking the vendor to provide you more evidence of GDPR compliance or other due diligence. So it makes a lot of sense to me to have it in your same AWS instance.
Absolutely. So basically, I mean, just to comment a little bit on the main features of the products. Operational backup and disaster recovery built in AWS. And what is interesting is that you can create flexible backup policies. You can back up, week, days, hours, down even to the minute. I know it sounds crazy, but that's because we leverage the snapshot capability. We automate the whole backup process and the creation of the snapshot, but also the whole recovery side. Okay. Again, as I said, it's an Amazon machine image that you can get from the marketplace, and that runs into your own AWS environment. Okay. So recovering for moment from any type of outages failure across AWS region and across account. Yeah, because sometimes region can be an issue. If a region in AWS is not available for a short period of time, we can recover in any region or even cross account. Imagine your AWS account become compromised. Okay, obviously all this is very rare, but if that happens, you want to be able to basically replicate your whole production environment to recover it in another account there. And it's very easy to use, very simple interface, and you get everything that you need: monitoring, alerting, reporting, and all this natively is shortcoming in AWS. You don't get that. You can obviously manually create snapshots, but it stops there. Okay, we're offering you all the reporting and traceability, for all your backup session down to the level of snapshot. So you can back up your instances, databases. We even offering file level recovery. Okay, there, and also application consistent backup, which is very important now.
So yeah, so we've got a number of folks that are using it and find that it's really a scalable solution, and that automation, especially when you're a larger shop dealing with 40 or 50 servers, not uncommon. That's absolutely the way to go. So I guess it brings us to the end, which means, yay, everyone, your bonus gifts. Plus, I think we've got some time now, about 14 minutes or so, to do some Q&A. So I think we're going to hear from Ezra, and he's going to help us out on some of the questions.
Thanks so much. That was absolutely great. And the bonus gifts will be arriving in all attendees' emails shortly. So just look out for those, the infrastructure credits and instructions to continue, as well as the GDPR cheat sheet. Thank you all for joining. Once again, the Q&A is open if you want to enter any questions into the Q&A panel. There are some questions in there already, and we'll go through some of them. So Ian and Laurent, Sir is asking, if a company is registered and working in a non-EU region, but its app or system is used by EU residents, is there an obligation on the company under the scope of GDPR?
So I'm going to go with what the actual text says, and there would be. But in practical terms, we don't know 100% yet, because, again, what's written is not necessarily what's enforced. And so I would say that the supervisory authorities are generally going to be focused on companies within their region. However, if something bad happens and it's a whole bunch of EU data involved, that's probably going to attract the eye of Mordor, as it were, onto your business. So I would tend to say that you probably want to look at GDPR as some great guidelines. And depending on what region you're in, Canada or the United States, some of them have state requirements that are very similar to GDPR. That right to be the right for disclosure of what data that organization has on you, and the breach notification. I think at this time about 47 states out of the 52 have the have data breach legislation notification.
So Marcel is asking if you can charge somebody that wants their data removed, since it will cost time and money.
Yeah, so there is a stipulation in GDPR for a nominal cost that and it's reasonable. That can be challenged. There's also a judicial process, a legal process outlined there that allows the company to delay and eventually not give, if they can articulate a reason why that they can't, the data to the subject. So again, it's not 100% black and white on what also is in scope of the personal data, because the definition of personal data varies from EU territory EU territory, or rather EU country to EU country. So again, this is an area where, is all of the metadata as well supposed to be disclosed. So that means every like, every comment that you made on somebody else's profile could very well be in scope of GDPR as well, for that erasure and for that that right to know what is being kept about you.
Awesome. And Laurent, Simon is asking if N2WS backs up EBS to S3. And can you explain a little bit more about what's going on with N2W backups?
Yeah, absolutely. We do actually back up EBS or EBS volume separately. I mean, when you back up an instance with our product, you will back up automatically all the volumes, or all the EBS volumes attached to it. Okay. So at the moment, we're actually backing up, by creating a snapshot and managing, the whole backup and recovery process. But this snapshot will appear in your snapshot section in EC2. Now, we are going to work on the possibility. I mean, we are working at the moment on the possibility to back up directly to S3, like a bit like when I say S3 is the S3 end user service, like S3 buckets, for a bit more long time, archiving. So yes, by I would say next month, beginning of quarter 2 of this year, you'll have the possibility to create your EBS snapshots and push them to S3.
Gim is asking, as data processors, how are we liable for what data controllers gather, which we have no control of?
That is a really good question. So you do have control, first of all. Now, what you'll need to do is prove that you have due diligence in place and that you vetted that supplier, okay, for the controlling part of that particular data, or the processing part of the data. So it really becomes a partnership. So as an example, say you're using something like Salesforce and you're getting customer data. Your obligation is to protect that customer data. But if Salesforce gets breached, the company, not your instance of Salesforce, then clearly you're as a victim organization, and GDPR would empower you to go upstream. Now, I love to say that anytime you get a regulation, you get two outcomes. You get insurance and you get litigation. So your customers may take action under GDPR against you as a business. You as a business may take action under GDPR up, and so on and so on. If any of those people have insurance along the way, that by the powers of subrogation, which is a legal entitlement that insurance companies have when they pay out a claim, they get to sue anybody for anything related to that claim that they've had to pay out. So when I said that the litigative landscape for GDPR to determine exactly what is in scope, what is not in scope, and what we are into the undiscovered country, let me tell you, because there is an awful lot that we don't know. And that's a great example of how that whole supply chain has to be aligned to those privacy controls.
Awesome. How much of GDPR policies can be used from other standards and rules, most particularly if you have PCI DSS or ISO 27001 implemented? Does it help?
Absolutely. It helps. So not only is it due diligence, okay, so as soon as you trot out there your PCI pen test or your ISO 27001 certification, the whole argument that you've been negligent can completely disappear if you're compliant. Okay. Now, where it comes down to the issues is maybe there are some things in GDPR that you're not quite compliant enough. Okay. So this is the thing that's maddening about GDPR, in that they don't tell you what the actual standards will be. They're letting the legalities and the best practices take up that slack. So as an example, in the UK, we have cybersecurity essentials. If you're certified cybersecurity essentials, does that mean you're GDPR compliant? Not necessarily, but it's certainly a step in the right direction to be exercising due diligence when it comes to protection. I will say though that if you look at COBIT, if you look at ISO 27001, they have stipulations for procedures and policies that need to be in place, like a vulnerability management program, for instance. That's a ISO 27001 requirement. That requirement is really great evidence that you're doing your best to protect your customers from known exploits by having a vulnerability management program in place.
Does using N2WS alone for backups make you more GDPR compliant, or are you expected to configure additional features?
I'll let Laurent answer that one.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you use our product Cloud Protection Manager, in terms of backup, yes. Okay. Now, obviously, backup is, as I said, the ultimate layer. Okay, there. You will need to put, obviously, other security layers in place, to be compliant with GDPR. But even if we go outside the pure, data security, as I mentioned earlier, when we were talking about the GDPR requirements, you need to be able to map your data. You need to be able to know who's doing what, with the data there. This is what is also very important in the GDPR. So it's not only purely the data protection, but it's also all the data traceability, okay, there.
Is there any law or regulation that restricts or prohibits the storage of data in a non-EU region where the customer is in the EU?
Sure, I'll take that one. So there is, it's called US Privacy Shield. And there's also something called corporate models. Privacy Shield is essentially a set of standards and laws that are designed to mirror the data protection requirements. However, you should keep in mind that there hasn't been a determination that Privacy Shield is good enough. The other mechanism is to have two corporate entities that have agreement to share data with privacy protections enacted on both for that compliance. The idea being is that you can have an American company and you can have a European company, and they can be allowed to share data between the two, subject to privacy controls that are enforced on both sides. The problem becomes, are those good enough? So the real question in my mind is that Privacy Shield as it is today might have to come under some refinements in order to make sure that the sharing is done in accordance with GDPR. So, more work and more to follow on that. There's nothing prohibiting under law moving data between the US and the EU so long as you're now compliant with GDPR.
What is your opinion about using business process management frameworks to identify critical GDPR processes?
Absolutely important. So if you do something like a COBIT audit, or you have some swim lane diagrams about how you're processing and collecting data, and you've identified key areas to put security controls around, that is probably the best architecture. So as an example, if you simply have an application that data comes in and that data is used to do custom framing windows and then an invoice is generated, you want to identify through that process where personally identifiable information is in that process and what kind of protections you have around it. That relationship and the relationship between those processes talking to one another, maybe they don't need to share all of that personal data at the front of the process, right? All the way through. What can be done is it can be collected, it can be anonymized with something like an order number, the order can be executed, and then the invoice and shipping details are kept in a different system that is more protected. So really that understanding business processes and where that data goes through is a fundamental part of understanding what you need to do to protect that personal data. Great question.
And Laurent, does N2WS offer any encryption features for handling data to achieve GDPR compliance?
Well, when it comes to encryption, especially in AWS, it's actually Amazon Web Services, providing that. Okay, so you have the possibility to encrypt your volumes and decrypt them. And you can also manage encryption key. It's all built up, in AWS. So why not using it? So this is exactly what Cloud Protection Manager does. Cloud Protection Manager can handle your encrypted volumes. And what is very interesting as well is that we can handle encryption keys. So when you do, for example, cross-region or cross-account disaster recovery backups, okay, we will handle those encrypted volumes. This means that we will obviously decrypt the volume, back it up, and re-encrypt it and copy the snapshots in the appropriate region or account as defined by your backup policy.
Well, just want to thank all of our attendees for joining us today. It was an engaged crowd, and we thank you all. We're reached the top of the hour, and we're gonna close it down. Your questions were recorded. If we didn't have time to address them live, we will definitely follow up with you. Thank you all so much. Thanks to Ian and Laurent for presenting today, and hope to see you all at a future event.